There's been a lot of research on different parenting styles. And we have observed 4 styles in our research for the most part. And the styles vary along the continuum of how much decision-making is practiced with their kids versus how much parents tell their kids what to do versus whether parents tend to want to be more like their friends with their kids versus parents tend to step back and let their kids figure it out on their own. So the 4 different styles that represent those themes are authoritarian. That's more of a dominating parent that tells their kids what to do at all times. An authoritative, or what we call a positive parenting approach, and that's where parents recognize a relationship and they're building it. They still hold all the cards, but they want their kids to develop and evolve into being able to be good decision makers and good productive people in the world. And then there's the overprotective parent that wants to put a bubble around the kid and carry them around. And then there's the permissive parent that says, they're kids, they'll be fine, don't worry about everything. So those are pretty much the 4 styles. Interestingly, we've seen different amounts of drinking that goes on based upon these styles. And partly it's because of the decision making and the teaching of decision making. And so if I had to summarize this really quickly, I'd say the positive parenting approach that teaches kids how to make decisions is going to be the most effective one to reducing the risks. And part of the reason is that parents aren't there all the time, and we know that. And more often than not, when kids do this, it's going to be in an environment where there's mostly younger people. So you put a younger person in a position where there's peer pressure, in a position where there's a lot of bad decision-making going on, you're going to need a kid that makes really strong decisions to be able to work their way through that environment. So the positive parenting, because it builds decision-making in their children, the parents don't have to be there for their kids to behave in a more positive way. Whereas for the other styles, that there's less decision-making that's going on in terms of teaching your kid how to make good choices. So authoritarian parents make all the decisions. They tell the kids what they can do, when they can do it, when the curfew is, who they can spend time with, who they can't spend time with. And the decision-making is gone. Now it's your parent. And what we've seen with authoritarian, children that come from authoritarian parenting approaches, is that those kids are ill-equipped to make choices, and they tend to behave really well when they're around their parents because the consequence is usually punishment. But when they're not with parents and there's no one else to make decisions, they look to somebody else to make the decisions, and that somebody else is usually a peer. So if their peer's not making good choices, then they can be in trouble. For the overprotective parent, they sort of do the same thing. They don't punish as much, but they put a bubble around the child and they try and keep the kid from having the harms that are associated. And we all know the world can be a risky place. And so not, again, having a parent to protect you at all times puts you in a position where you're not going to be making choices. You're going to look to somebody else to protect you, and that protective person could be a peer. And once again, we know that that's another young person with not fully developed decision-making. And then finally, the permissive parents. Permissive parents are an interesting group because they're really not all one group. There's permissive parents that think they can teach their kids how to do things that are risky in a way that makes them safe. But there's also permissive parents that say, well, when I was a kid, I did that and I turned out fine. And so they kind of form this sort of group that lets their kids sort of navigate through these, what I call sort of minefields of youth, in a way where they don't guide them. And they don't really help them in the way that's most positive. And it's interesting, we found the highest level of drinking and drinking to risk in the kids of permissive parents, as well as authoritarian parents, and the lowest level of risk in the protective parents. And it's study after study after study we see this. We see a very consistent pattern. Never do we see that the permissive parents are more positive, and never do we see that the authoritarian parents are more positive. This is very challenging for parents because they might have been raised by authoritarian parents, or they might have been raised by permissive parents, and they may have turned out just fine. And so they feel that that's the best way to do things because they turned out just fine. And the data really just don't support that. So I don't want to tell them that they're behaving in a risky manner, but if I had to make a decision or somebody asked me what's the best thing I could do, I would encourage them to try and take a more positive parenting approach. So our data show that parents change, just like young people change. They change their styles. In fact, it's not uncommon for two parents in a home to have slightly different approaches to try and find some common ground when they work with their children. So parents are capable of changing styles, and they might even change styles from day to day. So for example, on a good day, they might be a positive parent. They talk to their kids, they ask how, what, and why questions. But on a day that's a little more stressful, they might turn a little authoritarian, like say, come on, get your coat, we gotta go. And so parents have to recognize that they're also people, and people make mistakes. And I think most parents are fully aware that they're going to make mistakes from occasion to occasion. The good thing is that people can change in a positive way. And the data have actually shown that we find that through the brief intervention materials that MAD has provided, and some of the work that we've done with some other parenting works that are very similar, is that we find the biggest changes in the authoritarian and the permissive parents. So the authoritarian parents recognize that there's risks involved, that their approach works sometimes but not others, and the ones that are willing to change and do change, their kids will also then change. And so the nice piece about it is that you can turn from telling your kids what to do all the time to telling them what to do sometimes when you're stressed out, but for the most part turning around and saying, okay, let's switch this around today. How might we do this? What should we do here? And again, that'd be an easy way to change. For the permissive parent, they can turn and say, I know that in the past I've done this way. I haven't seen that that's always worked out, so let's try it a little differently. And so there's opportunities for everybody to change. So the question that exists in the scientific world is, can parents teach their kids how to drink safely or be exposed to alcohol in small doses so that they can then, when they're out in the world, act responsibly? Parents are teachers. They become teachers very early on, and they are teachers, just like the school teachers are teachers and doctors are teachers. And there's all these different forms of teaching that goes on, and we have a lot of different expertise. What we don't have are any studies that show what the ideal and optimal teaching method is when it comes to what would I do to teach my kids about alcohol. So one approach would be to allow them to maybe have a glass of wine at a special occasion, a family occasion, a wedding, or something along those lines, or a graduation or something in that way, where there's a lot of parents around and they can monitor the behavior of the young person with alcohol. Although the data don't seem to support that either, when kids go out and drink, they generally aren't with adults that are monitoring their behavior. They're with other people their own age. And so even in the situation where there's high monitoring and control over the amount of alcohol and all the things that go with that, that doesn't really resemble their lives. And our data show that when kids are drinking in controlled settings at home with their parents, those kids tend to drink more frequently outside the home and to higher blood alcohol concentrations. Other people have found that even giving kids sips of alcohol at home, those kids are more likely to drink more frequently outside the home and at higher blood alcohol concentrations. So the data from numerous places and numerous locations using different populations of kids and different populations of parents have shown only a positive effect positive and not a good thing, but the more that you drink here, the more likely you're to drink there. So the data don't support this idea that parents are really effective at teaching their kids by giving them small amounts. And it's in fact the opposite. And in fact, some parents turn around and say, well, in other countries where the drinking age is lower or there isn't a drinking age, they don't have as many problems as we have here in the US. Well, actually, that's not accurate at all. The data show that in countries where there's a lower drinking age than in the United States, the youth usually have more problems rather than less problems. And the only problem they seem to have less of is impaired driving. And it has very little to do with the fact that those kids are better drivers. It has more to do with the fact that usually those kids don't have access to cars. Gasoline is far more expensive. and so on, rather than in our country where young people are driving at a lot earlier age and their gas is much more affordable. So again, there's not really studies that have shown a positive benefit in any way. And there's been so much work that's been done on this. If there was even one good study out there, we'd all know about it, and it just doesn't exist. So when I've had the opportunity to talk to my own children or other people's children about this, I always say something along the lines of, well, if it was the right thing to do, we'd have the American Medical Association recommending we do this as parents, and they don't. We would have the teachers at our high schools when we come in for our parent-teacher meeting saying, don't forget, help your kids, this is one way to do it, and they don't either. The scientific community doesn't think this is a good idea. The people that are in public health and public policies have set up laws to protect our kids because it's not really, it's based on evidence, not just guesses. The American Medical Association, the American Pediatric Association doesn't recommend it. So if you look at the overwhelming amount of evidence of individuals say, this is really not a good idea, it's still somewhat surprising that parents turn around and say, I could do this, not having any experience doing it and really not having any guide to follow to do it. We also really wouldn't do this with other risky behaviors. So we're in the midst of the largest opioid crisis in our country that our country's ever faced. And I don't see parents saying, you know, I'm going to help my kid by giving them some opioids now so that when they're out in the world, they won't use opioids. I don't know any parent that's saying it's okay for my kids to use a little bit of heroin when they're at home. And a lot of kids do this, so we may as well just give in and we can supervise their heroin use. And yet with another drug, alcohol, there are definitely a group of parents that think this is an acceptable approach. A long time ago, my oldest son came to me and he turned and he said, Dad, do you think we'll ever have a beer together before I'm 21? And I said, you know, if I didn't know what I know about this, I might say yes. However, you know, I'm your father, so I don't want to harm you by doing this. And I know quite a bit about the science that there really isn't a good way. And me, of all people, have spent 30-something years figuring out how to do this. You'd think that I'd have a few tips on how to do this, and I don't. So that being the case, I turned to him and I said, well, you know, you play baseball, and there's 20 kids on your team, your high school team, you do traveling. Of the kids on your team, how many would you say drink on weekends? And he said, about 17 or so. I said, okay, of the 17 or so, how many kids do you think have it really together? I mean, they're really good citizens in the community, they're really doing well in school, they have their futures well thought out. He said, well, 1. I said, okay, so 1 out of 17, those aren't really good odds. If you were going to make a decision about what career to choose, and you're only going to be successful 1 out of 17 times, would you choose that career? He said, probably not. So I also turned to him at that point, and I said, you know, I always try to get you to be a critical thinker. So what I'd like you to do is this. I want you to go out and find some evidence, you know, just go and search it out, about how this will improve our relationship. And if you can come back to me with evidence on how this is going to improve our relationship and improve your health as well in some way, I'll buy you that drink before you're 21. And he said, no, I think I'm good. And it wasn't that he was saying, no, I think I'm good because he was blowing me off. He just thought about it and thought, I can't think of something that would, how this will help our relationship to have that. And I kept asking the how do you think this will work? What do you think? Why would you do this? You know, kind of approach. And I felt pretty good about that.